What's up, everybody? I hope you're doing well. Welcome to the extended cut, minimally edited podcast version of today's episode, where we're going to tackle therapist mistakes, the kinds that we all make. We're not going to tackle the really big no-nos. We're not going to tackle the big ethical errors, the legal mistakes that do happen, but I would argue don't happen to all of us. But since we're all human beings, at least for now until AI takes over, 100% of us will make mistakes. And I want to talk about those very human mistakes that even the most ethical of therapists, the most follows all the best practices of therapists out there will still make at least some of these mistakes that we're going to cover today. I want to normalize the mistakes because it happens to all of us. Somehow my anxious, perfectionistic brain absorbed messaging in grad school that you're never allowed to make any mistakes, which I think was partly me and partly the teaching. So if anyone else is carrying that narrative, I would like to undo it, because again, you cannot be superhuman. That's not how it works. And I would also like to talk a little bit about how to engage around these mistakes, how to do some repair work when necessary. And I would argue a lot of times healthy repair when we make a mistake as a therapist is a lot of the meat and potatoes of healthy healing therapy work. So I'd love it if we reframed mistakes as not a full-on mistake, but just a genuine human interaction. And I'm more interested in seeing how we interact around the mistakes rather than making sure we never make any mistakes at all costs. Always, 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 always. But of course, if there is some pattern of mistakes, then take action to do what you can to minimize those mistakes. But eventually, even if you do everything just right, you will make some of these mistakes. I was thinking about making this episode anyway, and I was looking into research about what type of mistakes are really common therapist mistakes. And I actually found it a little bit harder to find hard data about this. I did find an article from 1989, which was great, but I think probably outdated. So instead, I turned to my dear friend, Reddit, and the Our Therapist subreddit did not disappoint. So I already started putting this episode together, and then I thought, what are other therapists saying are some of the common mistakes that they're making? And I sprinkled some of those in here as well, and we're gonna talk about them. Now, before I dive into it, I'm gonna give a little disclaimer, because I need this disclaimer, so maybe some of you might need it too. But as I was going through some of the mistakes that therapists were sharing on Reddit, there were a few that personally, as Marie, therapist Marie, I have, at least so far, never made before. There were a few mistakes that I thought, I wouldn't be caught dead making that mistake. However, that's a reflection of me at this point in my career, at this point in my life, and my own unique kind of wiring, skill sets, that sort of thing. And there's other mistakes that I have definitely made more than once. So I think that might come up for some of us, at least watching or listening, where we might think wait, that mistake seems completely unacceptable. And if you have that reaction, I invite you to just reflect on yourself and your own skill sets and capacities, wirings, personality, anything in that realm, to see are there certain advantages that you might have that make it more accessible, or you're more able to avoid those mistakes for the most part, whereas somebody else in a different context might not have as easy of a time avoiding those mistakes. So that was a big disclaimer, but I saw that come up for me, and I'm not going to name which mistakes I had that reaction to, but I think a lot of us will have that to different kinds of mistakes, if that makes sense. Okay, the first mistake that I saw all over Reddit, it came up for multiple therapists, so I'm sure this has applied to at least some of you listening or watching, is forgetting a session. Whew, that's tough. And depending on the context, could create a very awkward scenario. Like if you are walking into your waiting room and your client has been sitting there for God knows how long waiting for you, like that, you're there, you are in the repair moment already. They're probably really upset with you. I mean, if I were the client, I would be livid if that happened, even though in my brain, I'd also be saying okay, Marie, it happens. Maybe it was they got in a really bad car accident and you shouldn't be mad. And then they're just coming in, they forgot, it's a scenario we like to try to avoid, right? Obviously, we're not trying to invite that scenario, but it happens. Obviously, you're not always in a scenario where you're going to have an immediate interaction with that client, especially if, let's say, you're meeting virtually, then you're not going to have the waiting room run in like that. Or maybe they were, waiting in your waiting room and you weren't even showing up to work that day. They're just hanging out. But one way or the other, whenever you have a conversation about this, it's going to be tense, right? It's going to feel a little bit like, ooh, I messed up. Later in the episode, we're going to talk about different ways to approach the repair process. But I'd say for me, generally speaking, if this were to happen to me, one, definitely this merits an apology. But I think there's more than just saying like, I'm so sorry, that was a mistake. Obviously, it was a mistake and we wish we could take it back and we can't. But it's also really important to check in, see like, how is this affecting your client? I think even if a client was like, oh, no worries, it happens to everybody, I would at least probe a little bit. I don't want to create a narrative for them that's not there, but I might even say something like, you know what, if I were in your shoes, I know for myself, I would be pretty upset about this. Maybe not everyone would be upset about it, but I really think it's worth checking in to see like, how has this affected you? Has anyone ever done anything like this to you before? Now, it is possible that your client is like a saint or just, wired totally differently than I am and not especially bothered by it, or it was just, a slight annoyance that only takes a moment to repair. But I could see clients potentially requiring quite a bit of repair work for this kind of error. So just kind of check in and see what their needs are, but I wouldn't skip over it. I would not brush this under the rug quickly. Whereas some of the other errors might potentially be able to be kind of skipped over relatively quickly. Another common therapist error that folks brought up in the Reddit land was mixing up our clients' stories or, confusing certain details in our clients' stories. Let me tell you, this is a mistake that a younger version of myself would have thought like, I will never be caught dead mixing up my clients or their details. But now that I've had 2 babies and I've entered perimenopause, brain fog is part of my life in a very real way. And so at this moment in time, it enters my mind where I'm sitting with a client and then I'll go, oh yeah, this and that about their loved one or their situation that they're in. And then I'll have that checkpoint where my brain goes, wait, was that this client or was that client? And right now, I still have that checkpoint that goes, well, are you sure that was this client? And I'll kind of catch it enough where if I need to ask a clarifying question or just kind of hold a thought to myself a little bit longer before I get more information, I will. But I could see myself in 10 years just like, blah, 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 and, thinking that I'm talking about one client's situation, but I am very much bringing up something from a different client's experience. It usually comes out not in the most significant parts of someone's experience, but it might be things like, oh, when you traveled to such and such last week, and maybe this client did travel last week, but they didn't travel to that location. They traveled to a different location, and I mixed up 2 clients who both traveled on the same week and mixed up their travel destination, or things that aren't particularly deep per se for most people at least. But this can definitely happen with more significant items. And people did share variations of the story where you made up family members that aren't really there because you're confusing this client with that client, and that client has this conflict with their sibling, but this other client doesn't have any siblings. It could go any number of ways and spiral. Now, we're also making an assumption that our clients will correct us if we make a mistake like this, but sometimes it's even more of a nightmare in my mind to, in the Rolodex of my brain, think through moments and be like, wait, did I get that wrong? And then the client just sort of was quote unquote being nice and didn't correct me. And you know what? That may have happened. And I may never know. That feels like more of a nightmare. Hopefully, at least sometimes our clients will correct us, or at least say wait, what? What are you talking about? And we can catch it and do whatever repair is needed. If this happens to you, just know, we are storing so much information in our brains. So, if you're finding it consistently really difficult to remember a lot of significant details about your clients, then that's definitely something to look into. But there's no way we're going to hold every single every single detail about every single client in our minds at all times. And so, if we manage to let one of these mistakes slip up where we mix up details about two of our clients' lives and switch them over, to just be a little bit more accepting that that is a possibility and to make appropriate repairs as needed. And as uncomfortable as this can feel, especially depending on the detail that you're not sure about, but if you're ever feeling unsure, it's always okay to ask your client to clarify or to remind you. And it's okay to kind of own up the parts that you're feeling around it without making it into a bigger thing than it needs to be. But, it might be something like, hey, this is a little embarrassing for me to acknowledge this, but I'm having a little bit of trouble remembering this detail about your life. And I was about to say something about it, but I was feeling a little unsure. Can you remind me, tell me about your siblings and their names, or, where was it that you traveled to last week? Or what was the story that you shared with me last time we met? There's some details around it that I got a little fuzzy on. And that way you can at least own your space and call it like it is, rather than just being overly confident and stepping right into it. But sometimes we don't realize it and we step right into the trap anyway, and we can still repair it afterwards. All right, I can just feel the cringe for this next one. But the next error is calling a client by the wrong name. I personally haven't made this one just yet, but I have called clients' loved ones by the wrong name. Like, I'm meeting with a client individually and I'll refer to their spouse and call them the name of a different client's spouse. Listen, there's a lot of names that we're keeping track of in our little brain Rolodex, and yeah, that's bound to happen sometimes. If this is something that happens to you a lot, I think it's okay to just own it about yourself. To say, like, you know what? I have this capacity to remember the minute details of like what you ate in your sandwich 4 sessions ago, but for whatever reasons, names just leave my mind. So I'm so sorry. I may need reminders of the names of your loved ones, or, I've been known to misspeak and call my clients by the wrong name. Just know it's not you. I do this all the time. And if it's not something that happens for you all the time like that, but it comes up and it happens one time, no need to flip your lid. Of course, check in with your clients, see how it's affected them. And I think it's appropriate to show some level of like genuine, whether it's, embarrassment or like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I cannot believe I just made that error. But it's also not usually particularly helpful to like overly linger on it. Like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I did that. And oh, I'm so sorry. I've never done that before. And yeah, there's no need to like make it into something bigger than it was. A little later in the episode, we'll touch on some of the reasons why it's not so helpful to be overly apologetic. But yeah, just let it take up the amount of space that it needs and then move on if your client seems ready to move on. But before we continue our conversation, I'd like to thank Powbox for sponsoring today's episode. It wasn't until a couple years ago that I first learned that even with a signed BAA, Google Workspace and Microsoft 365 can't guarantee that 100% of the messages going in and out are HIPAA secure. So without a tool like Powbox operating on the back end, it's almost impossible to stay HIPAA secure unless you forego email altogether. Even if you exclusively use a secure portal to discuss protected health information with your clients, there's still going to be potential clients reaching out initially, and also some clients who will still try to email you because, they forgot their password for their portal and they're trying to reach out. So with a tool like Powbox, you can guarantee that every single message is protected. Powbox is super easy to set up, and it's kind of a one and done situation. Like, you just spend a few minutes initially setting it up, and then it's just continuously quietly running in the background. Powbox offers a 14-day free trial to everybody, and they're offering a special discount to Private Practice Skills listeners. Just use coupon code SKILLS at checkout in order to receive $250 off your first year of Powbox. That's Powbox spelled Paubox. Thank you again to Powbox for sponsoring this episode, and now back to our conversation. Another category of mistake that several therapists brought up in the Our Therapist subreddit is jumping to advice too quickly, or jumping to advice at all. And a common version of this that multiple people cited was a client bringing up the question of whether they should stay with their partner or break up with their partner. And of course, We kind of know while we're sitting here and we're not invested in this specific story of this individual client that we know we don't just say yes or no. But sometimes, and I have been there, sometimes we watch our clients go through a situation with the same person that they're with, and in our minds, in our private thoughts, we think, oh, this person needs to end it with their partner already. Like, this partner is no good for them. If something like that happens, you can always circle back to it, if you either right away in that same session or the next session, and say, you know what? When we were talking about this, you brought up this question and I answered right away. That's not something that I typically do, but I think I went there because I really care about you. We can still acknowledge that like our human side kind of slid right in, shared some thoughts, and realized that when we care about somebody, it's harder to stay impartial. And so we can acknowledge oop, I see that you're going through a lot. I see that the situation that you're in is really hard, or it's, whatever the scenario is, it's affecting you in these different ways. And the part of me that really cares for you and wants you to thrive came in and started speaking. And I kind of took my therapist hat off for a second. But can we circle back? Can I put my therapist hat back on? And can we see what might be most helpful in this situation instead of what I said before? And another category of common therapist mistake is jumping to an incorrect assumption or diagnosis or treatment direction without getting enough clarification from our clients that this is the direction that they want to go. This can play out in any number of ways. I mean, it could be as simple as our client saying, I want some help because I'm feeling a bit anxious, and without any further clarifying questions, we just go, okay, tell me about how your mother treated you as a child. And there isn't this sense of is this a path that feels useful to this client in this situation with what they're bringing up? Even if that's your approach, a bit of prefacing can be helpful. Sometimes it can be helpful to go back and see if there's any patterns earlier in our lives that are tied to that anxiety. Would you be willing to walk down that path with me for a little bit? Let's see where it leads us, and we can always come back and try a new path, right? There's ways to kind of bring clients with us, but sometimes it can be really easy to just jump right in. I had a therapist who I saw for one session because, wow, he was horrible. He was horrible. I won't list all the ways he was horrible, but this is as a full-grown adult with my own private practice, in my late 20s, I went to go see a therapist, and I saw this guy for one session. And in the one session, he did a lot of things wrong. But one of the things that went wrong was we were just going through my childhood history, and a significant component of my history is that I grew up with severe panic disorder, which I've since overcome. And, I'm just sharing it in the timeline of my events. That's not what I was there to address in therapy. I wasn't there to address anxiety. It's just, hey, here's this significant item in the timeline of my history that, the therapist is asking about. And when I brought up panic disorder, he also interrupted to share this, but he started trailing off on how so many of his clients with anxiety have started taking, I think, oxytocin supplements or something that I've never heard of prior or since. And maybe it's a totally legitimate thing, but it was also this why are you trailing off about oxytocin supplements when I'm just telling you my story? He ended up talking about oxytocin for 20 minutes. So that was wrong on many levels versus, sometimes we have a blip where we go, oh, I have this thought about oxytocin and how a lot of my clients have found these supplements helpful. And then, oops, we can interrupt ourselves again and say, I'm so sorry. That's not why we're here though. You were sharing about blah, 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 carry on. He didn't get there at all. I think at some point I called him out. It's I don't think I really want to talk about oxytocin right now. I think I was just sharing my history, and he kept going. So never saw him again. Again, there are small issues and there are bigger issues, right? So if we continue the pattern when we get the feedback, then the mistake is starting to escalate into something much bigger. So now let's talk a little bit about how to react when one of these blunders comes up in therapy. And I think the biggest takeaway that I'd like to emphasize is it's really important to not overreact, and it's really important to not underreact. I think it's really tempting for some of us to go one way or the other in different situations. I think it's much more appropriate to assess in each scenario, like how big of a reaction is useful here and what reaction is kind of most effective at repairing what happened. So if you're in a scenario where you realize you made one of these blunders, if the session already ended and you're kind of going back and realizing maybe you made an error, or maybe you're waking up at 2 a.m. in a night sweat, realizing you made a big mistake during your session earlier that day. Like, if it's after the session, just pause. Don't do something right away to try to fix what happened. We want to take a moment to make sure your system is regulated before you take any action. So really the idea here is like, we wouldn't want you to respond from an emotion mind if we were to use our DBT language, but we want to take a moment to regulate and use a state of wise mind in order to respond. If it's 2 a.m. and you realize you made a big mistake, we do not want you to hop out of bed and write the 12-paragraph apology email to your client. Definitely wait until your system is more regulated first. I had a therapist that I've brought up in an episode a bajillion years ago on this channel, probably 4 years ago on this channel, that I did file an ethical complaint about for many reasons, not just the one I'm about to share, but one of the many blunders that she made was doing one of the errors we talked about today, which was she jumped really quickly to giving advice. And it was a scenario where I just mentioned something briefly. I didn't ask for feedback or advice. It was just like, here's a thing that happened in my week. And she immediately started giving me a lot of advice for like most of the session. And then I had to interrupt her at some point and say, hey, I actually wasn't looking for advice there. I was just sharing something that happened. There was something else I wanted to talk about today. I tried to be really gentle about how I named the blunder. Perhaps I wasn't gentle, but even if I wasn't, she was the therapist and I was not. I was but a mere graduate student at the time and like 22 years old or something. But she proceeded to call me over the weekend several times. She left voicemails. She was crying in her voicemails. She told me that she spoke in depth with her partner about how distraught she felt, like her significant other partner, about how distraught she felt for making such a blunder. And yeah, we don't want to do that, because now one thing that was like an unfortunate blunder in our session has now bled over and become a much larger blunder, because her reaction to her blunder actually made the situation worse. I get how there's a pull to react that way, but clearly like that's not what I needed from her. And, what it ended up doing to me as the client in the situation is I felt like either I needed to take care of her because she was freaking out, realizing she made a mistake and couldn't deal with it. So now do I need to comfort her as her client? Like there's a pull for that. And it's like communicating to me that like I can't really give feedback. My therapist can't really tolerate the idea of making a mistake. She doesn't have the ability to emotionally regulate if she does make a mistake. So, that was just one of many reasons why I ended up leaving that therapist and eventually filing an ethical complaint because of a slew of other reasons. But regulating before we respond, before we, call and leave that emotional voicemail apologizing while crying, just pause. And if you're realizing your blunder in session, it's okay if you're kind of like worked up about it. Like you call a client by the wrong name and they're like, that's not my name. And it's like, okay, clearly the blunder has happened and you're here. Then even if you are having a lot of, an emotional reaction, which is normal, you're kind of flipping your lid about it. It's okay to stay in the space without reacting from it, or even just like if a little teensy bit of self-disclosure helps you to calm your nervous system while also kind of giving your client permission to not have to deal with whatever your nervous system is doing. Like, you can self-disclose and say, oh my goodness, that's really embarrassing. That's something that I try my best to never do. And it just happened. I remember this was a therapist that I did overall enjoy. But I saw her long enough that I watched her make a few of these blunders that are just, we're human. It's so normal. And one of the quote unquote blunders, I wouldn't even call it a blunder. I think she just reacted to it in a way that made it a bigger blunder in my mind, was she forgot to silence her cell phone while we were in session. And so it made a little ding ding for a text message coming through. This is like 10 years ago when they still went ding ding. And I almost honestly didn't even notice it. I was like, oh, that must be my phone. And I saw, she's sitting in the chair across from me, and her face like almost goes pale. Like, she clearly is having a reaction to the fact that her phone is not on silent right now. And she goes, I am so sorry. That has never happened. I always make sure that my phone is on silent. That's very important to me. And so her reaction to this moment, that in my mind was like, oh, oopsies. For her, it clearly felt like much more than just a little oopsies. So that's why I'm calling it a blunder. Otherwise, in my mind, it's not even a blunder. It's like, oh yeah, whoops, you forgot to silence your cell phone. It happens. She clearly was really uncomfortable about it. So, it's okay to sort of say like, oh my goodness, I try really hard not to do that. So I'm feeling a little embarrassed that just happened. I'll do my best to not let that happen in the future. And then just checking in, like, how are you doing with that? And I mean, if she had just said that to me and said like, ooh, I'm so sorry. How's it going? Like, I would have been like, oh my gosh, it's totally fine. Let's just keep going where we were. We don't need to do anything with that. But she had a little bit of a bigger reaction to it that was bigger than I felt was needed. So, if it helps you to acknowledge, like, I feel embarrassed, I try really hard not to do that, but if you're okay, we can keep going, then that's totally fine. I already started touching on this, but like the next step is assessing the impact on our client. That's more important, not just the impact on ourselves. We can tend to that in our own time, but like, how is this affecting our client? And I think in a lot of cases, like, this is worth mentioning, our clients are often amused when we do an oopsies like this. Like, I kind of loved that my therapist, who I had seen as like, she always like, crosses her T's and dots her I's, and I thought was just so good at being above and beyond and keeping all the boundaries. Like, she forgot to silence her cell phone. Obviously, she normally has it silenced, and she did an oopsies. And to me, there's like an endearment. There's a like, yeah, you're a person. You forgot to silence your cell phone. It's so normal. And I felt mostly amused. So there's going to be a lot of these scenarios, not all of them, but a lot of these scenarios where clients might say like, oh my gosh, like, yeah, I did that the other week, right? They're just like, it makes you a person in their eyes. So keep that in mind, that might be one of the available responses, but there may be cases where our client is really negatively affected by our blunder. So it's important to assess and try to assess accurately. Like, some clients may be really impacted, but they might be sort of brushing it off, like some narrative in their mind. Or if we wear an IFS hat, we might say some part of them is saying like, don't make it a big deal. You don't want to be a complainer. You're just too sensitive, or whatever that part of their brain is telling them. So it's filtering out what they're really thinking or feeling, that they're really bothered or upset or hurt by what happened, but they're kind of like trying to regulate themselves, when this is a context where it'd be really great if they could say what's actually going on. So it takes some nuance to assess what the impact is for our clients. We don't want to overly ask if they really are like fine. And we say, are you sure you're fine? Are you sure? But, use your therapist skills to assess like, hey, am I noticing actually that maybe there might be something more? Or if you need to kind of couch it as like, I hear what you're saying, that this isn't especially bothersome to you, but I just know that, if it were me, it would really bug me, or I've had other clients find that really bothersome, or I've heard you share stories about others in your life where it really bothered you, but you didn't quite tell them. Can this be a space where we make sure, if it is really bugging you, let's talk about it. I want to, right? So there's ways to approach it therapeutically. And of course, any mistake you might have made, own it. That just claim it. Don't brush it aside. Don't say like, I had a really good excuse. I mean, sometimes clients might find it helpful to hear a little bit of context, or just whatever the context is of like, ooh, I'm so sorry. I slept through my alarm, and that's totally not acceptable. And yeah, that brings us to the next reminder to not over apologize. Like if you have said, I'm so sorry, that shouldn't have happened, I'm going to do what I can to not let that happen again, and then your client seems like they're okay and ready to move on, you don't need to keep bringing it up. I think at that point, if you're still bringing it up, unless you're seeing some signal from your client that it really is bothering them, but if you're just bringing it up because it's still on your mind, then that might be more reflective of something you feel like you're needing in order to move on from this. And your client shouldn't have to be the one to kind of tend to you, to maybe give you reassurance that everything is fine, that sort of thing. That'd be a great time to bring it somewhere else, like a trusted colleague, consult group, supervision, a place like that, to say, hey, I already did all this repair work, but it's still bugging me. Part of me kind of wants to still reach out to my client and ask if everything's okay. Like, can you help me see, did I miss something? And if it's fine to let it go, somebody else can kind of give you that reminder. Or if you're worried that it says something negative about you or whatever you need reassurance about, get it from somebody outside of your client. And ultimately, I think there is great value that when we make these mistakes, not that we try to do them on purpose for this reason, but when they just authentically happen, as they will eventually because we're human, then there's this really rich opportunity for repair. And I think repair work societally is so poorly modeled, and we have very few examples of how to move through mistakes with somebody we care about, that having it happen live in the therapy session and then you modeling what it looks like to own your mistake and repair it healthily can be one of the most valuable things we can offer to our clients in the context of the work that we're doing. There's a huge value in that. So I know that's not exactly like a step, an action step, but that is a helpful lens to keep in mind, to say anytime we make a blunder, to ask that question of like, how can I approach this mistake in a way that will offer the most healing to my clients, offer the best modeling of what repair should look like. And that is, I think, the best therapist hat we can wear while still bringing our human selves and authentically owning what we did, apologizing, seeing how it affected the other person. If it really affected them, making sure we circle back to it. Sometimes the repair work might take a long time. Like if you didn't show for a session and somebody is feeling abandoned because that's happened to them before in other situations, that might kind of be its own like segment of therapy even. So just keep all that in mind and trust that there's an opportunity to repair, and that might be one of the more healing opportunities available in your therapy work. And if you're hearing this and you're thinking like, I'm not totally sure about how to repair after some of this, then I think that's a great spot to check in with consult, check in with supervisors, check in with a trusted colleague to sort of say like, how do you do repair work like this? It is one of those things that is a little bit like an art, because I do it a little differently with each client, kind of depending on what I know about them, how they seem to be reacting in the situation. But it is always okay to come back to something in a future session. Like if you're unsure, you left it undealt with, and now like a couple of sessions has gone by, it's still okay and even good to bring it up, even say 3 sessions down the road, and say, you know what, I've just been reflecting on a moment that happened a few sessions ago, and I know you didn't say anything, but I realize I should probably circle back to it because I think I could have dealt with the situation a little bit better, or, I think I made an error, whatever it might be. And can we just circle back to it real quick? Because I want to make sure we kind of clear the air before we keep going. And your client might not even remember it or be totally fine, or they might say like, ooh, yeah, that bugged me, but I didn't know how to say anything, right? And so there could be a lot of meaty opportunities hanging out in there. So I hope I've conveyed in this episode that, one, mistakes are inevitable. It will happen. It has happened. Unless you are brand new in the field, it's probably happened somewhere, even if it's not on this list, and it certainly will happen. And the repair and how we tend to our clients and center their needs without making it about us is the valuable skill that we hope to learn. It's not to never, ever, ever make a mistake ever, or never make that mistake again. Certainly we do what we can to minimize mistakes, but even with our best efforts, we will make a mistake again. So Let's carry on in a way where we can repair well in a therapeutic way, rather than avoiding every mistake. Well, as always, I hope you found this episode supportive. If you clicked on it because maybe you made one of these mistakes or another one, it's okay. Just check in and see what amount of repair is appropriate for your client's needs. And if it's still bugging you after you already did it, then that's a good opportunity to check in with someone who's not your client, a colleague, a supervisor, etc. And until next time, from one therapist to another, I wish you well.